Recently, a subscriber asked if I could make a video about the myth that high brass shotgun shells are always more powerful than low brass shells. First of all, I legitimately had no idea that people didn't know this. Second of all, I'd like to remind everyone that if someone has a topic they'd like to hear about or a question they want answered, I'll probably be able to make a video about that subject. Anyway, different shotgun manufacturers like Stoeger or Benelli will mention a certain dram equivalent or a certain amount of shot at a certain velocity is needed to cycle their semi-auto shotguns. The reason why they don't say just use high brass shells is because high brass is not in any way a measurement of power or a reliable indication that the round will be more powerful. People generally use dram equivalent to measure the power of shotgun rounds. I could go into depth explaining the calculation to find the dram equivalent, but I think that's probably uninteresting and unnecessary. I say this because you'll likely find the dram equivalent either on the box of ammunition itself or on the manufacturer's website. There are two parts to this myth. The first part being if someone is looking at cheap, low-power birdshot, they notice that it usually has low brass. Then they notice that powerful buckshot and slug rounds usually have high brass. This is explained by simple economics. More brass on the cartridge results in more costs, so using less brass is just one of the things that can be done to get a less expensive product. Some companies will go even cheaper and use steel or brass-coated steel instead of brass. The second part of this myth comes from black powder days. Obviously, black powder requires more of a charge to get the same amount of power as modern smokeless powder does. So, people obviously wanted to maximize the amount of space for more powder. At this time, it was common to have paper-hulled shotgun shells instead of the plastic hulls we use today. One of the ways that you could increase the space for powder inside the shell is by using high brass. Brass is a lot thinner than the paper hull, so you could get a lot more powder in the cartridge and consequently more power. So if you happen to find a box full of random Wild West era ammunition in an abandoned saloon, the high brass shotgun shells will be more powerful than the low brass ones. Now that we are using plastic hulls and smokeless powder, the height of the brass is just not that relevant to the power of the round. And by this I mean you can get two shells of good quality, one low brass, the other high, load them equally with a stout load, and get equal results downrange. Today, if someone hands you a box of random shotgun rounds, it may be more likely that the high brass ones are more powerful, but it's hardly a guarantee. Going back to black powder days, paper hulls also had another problem. They could have small holes burned through them when the black powder was ignited. Obviously, when you have powder inside the shell that exceeds the length of the brass, it's very easy for the powder to burn through the paper hull and cause significant problems. One more thing, it is preferable to use roll crimp shells for black powder instead of star crimping. This is because the roll crimp leaves more room inside the shell for powder. Some people say that high brass is just a holdover from black powder days. And while that's somewhat true, I would also say it's a bit of an oversimplification. In my opinion, the greatest practical difference between low brass and high brass is reliability. It's fairly common knowledge that with certain shotguns, particularly semi-autos, high brass can cycle more reliably than low brass does. So there's a legitimate need for high brass in some shotguns. If both low and high brass were exactly the same, I believe the cost savings of low brass would persuade manufacturers to only make low brass rounds. What's interesting though is that problems with low brass ammo isn't specific to just semi-autos. Pump actions and double barrels can also have this problem. So the obvious question is, what's going on? Since this problem affects manually operated actions, we can immediately point out that a lack of power is not causing this. We can also point out that not all guns have this problem, so it must be a combination of both the shotgun and the ammo. The heart of the problem seems to be two things: a chamber that's a little rough, and the fact that low brass shells deform a bit more than high brass when fired. Brass deforms less than the plastic hull, so when you have a smaller amount of brass supporting the plastic hull, this can cause more deformation and friction. Another likely factor is that smooth brass is pretty slick, which can aid extraction. If you remember Paul Harrell's first video about his coach gun technique, he mentions that one chamber of his shotgun was rusted at one point, and because of this, it requires noticeably more effort to extract the shell from that chamber. Likewise, if you have a pump-action shotgun that won't run low brass rounds out of the box, it may have come from the factory with a rough chamber. Obviously, the chamber is not the only thing that can cause unreliability. For example, the same thing can happen with a rough magazine tube. By the way, I found that if you have a slightly rough magazine tube, you can smooth it out by simply working the follower over the rough spot many times. The same thing would happen in regular use, but if you smooth it out beforehand, you can avoid a lot of frustration. As for semi-autos, the inability to cycle low brass can be caused by even more things. For example, lack of proper lubrication. This would include failing to clean off thick factory grease. You could also have a gas system that is generally not working right or not designed for light loads. And finally, you could also have springs that haven't broken in yet. When everything is right, you should be able to use both low and high brass with no problems. If you can't use low brass rounds, that's probably a sign that something isn't quite right. There was a video where people were testing a Remington 870. This gun had been totally submerged in water at one point and had a dirty chamber. They were using low brass rounds and having significant difficulty extracting the spent shells. This kept happening until one of the spent shells was firmly lodged inside the chamber. Instead of extracting the round, the extractor simply tore off a piece of the rim. Then they switched to high brass rounds, which worked noticeably better. You may remember back when the Army was looking for a new pump shotgun, they had a specification that the shotgun had to have 2 extractors. I used to wonder, was this really necessary considering the Benelli M4 had only 1 extractor? Anyway, I think now that the Army made the right decision with this 2 extractor requirement. 2 extractors are a good advantage to have with a dirty chamber. It's not hard to see that someone could get a dirty chamber during combat, especially in a sandy environment.